Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover the New Testament using the translation by David Bentley Hart. This is the fourth episode I've done in the Bible this year. I covered three different parts of the Hebrew Bible in the first three episodes, and then this fourth book is the New Testament. So this is book 4 for my 2024 reading list. Well, I made it. I ended up reading the entire Bible in the first 2 months of this year. So I'm recording this right now on February 29. So we have leap year this year, and I'm thankful for that extra day because it took me that long to finish it. I finished it this morning. I read the final part, and it's always a good feeling. I mean, it's taking two months out of each year to read one book. And this is the third time I've done it. I made it all the way through, and each time I finished on the last day of the month. So I'm obviously, spacing it out, but I'm never quite certain if I will finish it by the end of February. But for 3 times now, I have done that, and it's been such a good thing. I did it the first time in 2020, and then again last year, and then this is the third year I've done it. I do plan to do it all the years of my life going forward, so just a different version and different translation each time. So this year I read the David Bentley Hart translation of the New Testament. And as far as I can recall, this is the first time I've ever read a translation of the New Testament that was completed by an individual. And I say that as opposed to one that's completed by a committee. So almost every other Bible version I've read has been, the CSB version was the one I did in 2020. I've read the NIV, the NASB. There's different versions, but they're all done by a committee of people, but this one was done by an individual. And David Bentley Hart, in his introduction, talks about that. He talks about the differences and how with a committee you end up starting to have kind of a similar voice through the whole book, even though there's different authors and different ways that they've written and different manners of style and all that. Whereas one of David Bentley's goals was to maintain that unique voice of the different authors of the books of the New Testament. So let me take a step back here and just talk about David Bentley Hart's aim for this translation and this version, and then I'll get into a few other items here in the introduction. So here's David Bentley Hart speaking in the introduction. My principal aim is to help awaken readers to mysteries and uncertainties and surprises in the New Testament documents that often lie wholly hidden from view beneath layers of received hermeneutical and theological tradition. End quote. And then I'm going to go to his postscript at the very end of the book. And then here he talks about one of his goals. The attempt was to make an original text visible through as thin a layer of translation as I can contrive to superimpose upon it. End quote. So just the bare minimums of what you can do with a translation to make the original text come alive as possible. And he talks a lot about the difficulty of doing that and the difficulty of even us understanding the words in the text as it comes to us, so far removed from that time, and yet it is very approachable as well. So he kind of talks about all those different things. Here's one other part in the introduction I want to highlight. He says this: I suspect that many readers will be somewhat taken aback by the absence of many terms they are accustomed to finding in the New Testament. And here is a list of the terms he's talking about: eternal, forever, redemption, justification, repentance, predestination, world, hell, and so on, and by the very presence of very different terms in their places, end quote. And that is one thing that startled me in the reading of this book. So the way it's set up is there is this introduction, and he just kind of gives a very quick overview of what you're getting into. And one of those things is that you will notice that there are words that are different than what you're used to. And that was something that stuck out right away. So you've got this introduction, and then he goes straight into the New Testament. And in the New Testament, he does not have a lot of footnotes. So I just came off from reading the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that was translated and commented upon by Robert Alter. And in that Hebrew Bible, the footnotes they take up more of the page than the actual text of the book of the Bible in many of the pages. So you contrast that with David Bentley Hart's edition of the New Testament here, and most pages don't even have a footnote. So if there is a footnote, it's a super important thing that he wants to highlight. So you're pretty much just getting the New Testament as he's translated it. Very few interruptions, very few footnotes. And then at the very end, you've got this postscript that I just found to be very helpful. So as I'm reading the New Testament, as I'm coming across these terms like that I just mentioned that don't show up, but in their place are these words that I'm not accustomed to seeing when talking about this. So one example is there is a lot of talk about the world in the New Testament, and the world as like the way that the world lives and that kind of thing. But the way that Hart translates it is cosmos, and he uses that term every time. And I guess the actual Greek term is cosmos, but most of the translations that you'll come across, they translate that as world. But he translates it as cosmos, and I'll get into why he describes why he does that, and I'll share that in the next segment here. But it's very startling, and I don't necessarily like that term, like cosmos. It's a weird term. So what does it mean? But that's exactly the point, is that as I'm reading it, I'm coming across these terms that are different, and it startles me, it jars me. And that's the exact word that he uses in the postscript. And he said one of his purposes was to do that. And in fact, he acknowledges that you will be jarred by reading this translation, especially if you're used to different translations of the New Testament. But I find that to be so helpful. I've heard the Bible read many times. I've read it at different points in my life, and I've read these different translations. And once a verse becomes common, maybe it's one that I've heard a lot, it's like my brain just shuts off. I was like, okay, I've heard that before. I know what it's going to say. I just kind of shut off and wait until that person stops quoting and then says what they're going to say about it. But when you come across a translation like this that is so different from what I've read in the past, it makes you stop and think, okay, why is this word being used here? What's the idea that the original author was trying to get across? What's going on? And so I love that aspect, and just the brilliance of the way that this one was set up, where you've got that introduction saying, hey, there's going to be some words that are a little different from what you're used to. And then bam, you just get into the New Testament. There's very few notes in that. And then, okay, here's the postscript. And in the postscript, there's a number of sections, but one section is just like, hey, here are the words that I used and why I used them. And so cosmos is one of the words that he highlights, and he highlights a bunch of other, like the word for eternal. He never uses eternal. He uses the word age or ages, and he describes why. And I just found that to be so helpful. And because by the time you get done with the New Testament, you're like, what? Why use these terms? What do they mean? Why have I always read world, but here it's cosmos? And then to have a description of why that's the case in the original Greek word and in other literature of the time of how they used that word, and so helpful. So if you're in that boat where you're just kind of like, you've heard the Bible a lot, maybe you kind of want a fresh read of it, this might be a good one for you to go by. But yeah, just I loved the setup. I really enjoyed this New Testament. I probably will return to it again at some point in my life. I want to give, I did this in a few of the episodes about the Hebrew Bible, but I want to give just kind of an overview of the narrative arc of the New Testament. What's just startling to me as I read through the entire Bible and do this each year is just how it ties together. I mean, it's really extraordinary for all these different books written so far apart in different styles and genres and all that, and for there to be this kind of overall narrative arc to it. But then within the books, there's narrative arcs, and within the the divisions there are narrative arcs. So like within the New Testament, you've got a narrative arc to it. And so just very basics here. You've got 4 accounts at the very beginning, 4 different books that give an account of the life of Jesus. After that, you've got this book, the book of Acts, and Jesus has died, he is resurrected, and then he ascends into heaven. And it's kind of like, now what? Now? How then shall we live? What do we do now? And the Spirit comes and indwells in these disciples that had followed Jesus around. But something else happens in that other people get this Spirit, and they are called Gentiles. And so there's this question of what does this all mean? What the heck is going on here? And then you've got this guy named Saul, and he has a tremendous conversion, and then he starts doing these missionary journeys. And so after the book of Acts, then you start having these letters, and many of these letters are written to these assemblies, these churches that Paul, who used to be named Saul, that he has started. And so you start reading these different letters going out. At the very end, you've got the book of Revelation, where John is describing visions that he has had of these grand events in the cosmos. And so there's this overall narrative arc to it, and then a narrative arc to the entire Bible. There's this promised covenant a promised new covenant that the person is given a new heart. And you start seeing that played out in the book of Acts. You start seeing that played out, and then just kind of these questions of what does this all mean? How does this tie to the Hebrew Bible? How does this all work together? And so that's a lot of what's being worked out in the New Testament here. And obviously that's the very, very quick overview of the New Testament, but I do love thinking about it in that narrative arc type of thing. And then just reading straight through the Bible really does help to see kind of those big narrative arcs of it. And so that's one thing I really enjoy each year. As for an initial reaction to the New Testament here, I had parts that just really stood out to me this time, and I love when that happens. So this time in John 6, that really stuck out. Acts 26. In fact, the entire book of Acts was just I just loved it. But it's really like, after having read the Hebrew Bible and having that all lead up to the book of Acts, and you see these people trying to grapple with what happens now, but looking back to and making sense of it all. Like it's really exciting to read it, especially having just come off of the Hebrew Bible. Romans, Romans, there's kind of an argument. There's a number of arguments, but there's a broad one, and I was just able to track with it this time. And again, I think that is also just as part of that, trying to read straight through the Bible. I just sat down and I read like the first 8 chapters of Romans in one sitting, and it just helped me to track the argument, because it's almost like, I think of it as like RAM, the random access memory when on your computer, where you're working on things and it's just kind of being stored in that quick memory, where you can access it quickly, but it's not in the deep memory quite yet. It's kind of like that, where you need that as you're reading through the Bible. Like there's parts of the argument, and you're like, I need that part of the argument to stick in my head while I continue on, and then I need to be able to access that quickly. But if I break it up, I'll forget kind of those quick things that I need to have still stuck in my head. So yeah, one other thing that really stuck out is just the Romans, but the first 8 chapters in particular. Reading stats, I started February 19 and then finished this morning, February 29. It's a 642-page book. That includes both the introduction and the postscript. Total time on the New Testament with the intro and postscript was 23 hours and 32 minutes. It took me 11 days to read it, so that was 58 pages per day. For the entire Bible this year, I started January 1st, finished February 29. It was 3,834 pages total. Again, a lot of that on the Robert Alter translation was made up of footnotes that I didn't read. And so that's a lot of pages, but some of those pages would go by pretty quickly when I was just reading through the actual text. It took me 110 hours and 55 minutes total to get through the Bible. That was over 60 days, and so that averaged 64 pages per day. So in this episode, I have a sort of a balance between what is actually in the New Testament itself and then just the peculiarities or the certain things that were part of David Bentley Hart's translation specifically. So I'll cover kind of both of those in the next two segments. So segment 2, I will just cover some observations I had while going through the New Testament. And then in segment 3, I will close, as I usually do, with the one thing. So the one thing that really stuck out to me this time reading through the New Testament. Well, one of the really cool things that I've found in reading straight through the Bible is that it does a couple things. One is that just within the Bible itself, each year I read it, I pick up on new things. And then each subsequent reading, it's like I remember those things, and it just opens up new things that I didn't notice before. And that's an obvious thing. I mean, that would happen with any book. You just notice things each time you read it. But the other really cool thing is that I'm reading this. I'm starting each year off reading straight through the Bible, but this is part of a reading project. And in the reading project, I'm trying to read the great books of all time, the greatest books of all time. And I've made a list of 200 of them. And last year I started reading through those. And I started with the oldest book that we know. And I'm just making my way through 200 of them over the next 10 years or so. And as I read the Bible, though, I see terms, I see ways of talking about things. And then as I read these great books or other books that I'm reading for this project, I notice things as well. And then they kind of inform each other. And that's one of the reasons I want to read the Bible each year, is just to see how other literature interacts with the Bible. So much of the literature that we know is inspired by this, or it references the Bible, or it references different stories. And so just, I want to know it well, but then I want to see, I'm really curious if there are things that have influenced the Bible. And so I read the Epic of Gilgamesh last year, and that would have been around before the Bible. And there's a flood story in there. There's a deluge story that's very similar to the one in the book of Genesis, yet has very important differences as well. And so I love that aspect. I love just within the Bible itself, learning and then seeing those things the following year, but then also in the Bible in dialogue with these other works in dialogue with the Bible. And so one area in particular that I first noticed when I read through the Bible in 2020 was just this lack of content about the afterlife in the Bible, in the sense of heaven and hell, as we typically see them in artwork or talk about them. I did not see that. It's there, but not in the Hebrew Bible. Like God lives in the heavens, but there's not like, okay, when you die, you go to heaven and it's like this. And then hell, like there's Sheol and there's Hades, but there's not like hell. There's not like the version of hell that we normally see in movies or read about in books. And so that just got me really intrigued, because I was expecting to go in and just read straight through the Bible and see these things very clearly, and they were not there very clearly. And so that stuck out. And what I loved about this David Bentley Hart translation is that he hits that head on. And so he does that first just in his translation, in the words he chose and that sort of thing, but then also in the postscript at the very end, just he goes into this. And so he talks not only about the locations in the sense of a heaven and a hell, or a Hades or a Sheol, or these valleys that are talked about, but he also talks about the time aspect of it. So is it eternal? Is it for a period? Is it for an age? That kind of thing. So I want to read just a few parts here of the postscript that deal with this and that I found very interesting. The first is this: there really is no word in Hebrew that naturally means eternity, either temporal or atemporal, or any word that naturally means forever. He says, in other other translations, then the terms in Scripture mean eternal, typically rather than defectively, is not merely logically impossible to verify, but simply false. End quote. He later goes on and he says the way he deals with this is he using an uppercase letter to suggest something of its eschatological or otherworldly resonance. This leaves it to the reader to decide whether he or she wishes to read age here as meaning an eternity of duration, an eternity of quality, or indefinite, if long, span of time, or the age that is coming. Only in a few cases where the context warrants have I used a different rendering, end quote. And so he doesn't translate the term that you will see in most other translations as eternal. He doesn't translate it that way. He translates it as the age or the age to come or something like that. And that's his description of why he does that. He wants to leave it open to the reader to decide, okay, the age to come, does that mean an eternal age to come or a temporal? So stuff like that I found very thought-provoking. Whether he's right or wrong, just the idea of thinking about that, of considering it and looking at the original words used, how he translated them, how other translators translate them, and what that entails. I loved that. So that's just one example in the aspect of eternal. Now let me jump to another thing that he points out in the introduction that I thought was really interesting, and that is that the uniqueness of a translation by an individual. And so he contrasts that to the translation by committee, which is every other version of the Bible that I've read, where you can benefit in an individual doing it is, and what he really tried to have happen is to highlight the different voices of the different authors. And so in the introduction here, he says this about translation by committee. Most translations, in evening out the oddities of the text, tend to flatten the various voices of the writers into a single, clean, commodious style, usually the translator's own, end quote. And so what Hart did in this translation is to try to render the unique voice of each of the authors. And one of the ways that he did this was to use the present tense. And he mentions that this is actually done in the King James Version, but it's kind of hard to tell with the archaic language in the way it's presented. But the King James translators actually did a good job of this. But it was startling to read it because you're reading about things that happened in the past, and so how this is normally done in the translation is just everything is in the past tense. But what David Bentley Hart would do is there'd be a section is like, and then they went to this place, and so that's all in the past tense. But then once you get to that place, he goes to the present tense, and what it does is just give this sense of urgency in that you almost feel like you're there and like you're hearing it. Yeah, I almost had this like New Jersey guy voice in my head, and then he says he's going to do this, and he's going and that's like you feel there. And so I want to read an example, and this is from John, and then I want to talk about this particular story and that's how I'll close out this observation section here. So here we go. On the following day, he desired to go into Galilee. This is chapter 1 of the Gospel of John. And he finds Philip. And Jesus says to him, so again, there's that present tense instead of, and Jesus said, and Jesus says to him, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city from which Andrew and Peter came. Philip finds Nathanael and says to him, we have found him of whom Moses wrote in the law and the prophets, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth. And Nathanael said to him, can there be anything good out of Nazareth? Philip says to him, come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael approaching him and says to him, look, truly an Israelite, in whom there is no guile. Nathanael says to him, where did you know me from? Jesus answered and said to him, before Philip called you, I saw that you were beneath the fig tree. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. And I'll stop reading there. So you could hear that back and forth between the past and the present tense, and it's odd, just because like you just assume everything is going to be. You almost think it's a mistake, but this is how John wrote it. And so he tries to capture that, whereas a lot of the other translations will just have everything in the past tense. But I also wanted to point out this particular story. And what was great is that I had just read it, and then the church service I went to last week, they talked about this exact verse. And it's one of those stories that it's like, this has to be true. Like, this is such a crazy story that it's just so odd. Like it's one of those things. Like it's almost the craziest story is probably the true one, because you just couldn't make it up. But here, this guy Nathanael is told about Jesus, and his first inclination is to say, "Can anything good come from where Jesus came from?" So right off the bat, he's got low expectations. Can anything come out of there? And then Jesus says, "Before Philip called you, I saw that you were beneath the fig tree." And the way in the message that I heard this past week talked about that is what likely happened here is that something happened under the fig tree that was life-altering for Nathanael. Maybe it was his point of biggest shame in his life, or where something just tragic happened, and perhaps that was where he felt alone and didn't have anything, and maybe cried out to God but didn't expect God to be there or to see. And then whatever Jesus said to him, Philip goes from thinking that nothing good could come out of Nazareth to him saying, "You are the Son of God, you're the King of Israel." And it's just one of those, such a startling thing. Like, I think we can all relate. Like if someone came up to you and said, "I saw you at this point in your life," or "I saw you at the most painful place of your life," and perhaps you haven't even told anybody about it, or no one knows except a few people, but somebody out of the blue comes up and says, "I saw you at this horrible part of your life, or this transformational point in your life," and that causes such a change in this person that they have that kind of a reaction. And I just love that story. But there were so many times when I was reading the New Testament this time, that I saw stories like that I was like, gosh, this is just, it's so unique, and just it has this sense of like, that is so deep of an insight into people. And you can read it one way of like, okay, that's strange. Why did he have this sudden thing? But like, why, you kind of ask yourself, why did he have this sudden change? And it just makes it come alive. Back to the present tense thing. I loved how that aspect of this translation really brought these stories out in a different way. It helps you not to like get stuck like, oh, okay, all this stuff happened in the past, but it's like you get the sense that you're right there in the story, and I loved that about this version. All right, now on to segment 3 and the one key takeaway from the New Testament. Well, I kind of had a bit of an epiphany, I guess you could say, in Romans, when I read through Romans this time, and specifically chapter 5 and verse 12. And I love that this is what came about, because this is such a good mix of this particular version of the New Testament. So yes, I read the New Testament, but yes, it was also translated by Hart. And then I had mentioned that he didn't do footnotes, but this is one case where he did an enormous footnote. It's huge. And so this particular verse, he says, it constitutes one of the most consequential mistranslations in Christian history. And the verse is Romans 5:12, and it says this, according to Hart's translation: "Therefore, just as sin entered into the cosmos through one man, and death through sin, so also death pervaded all humanity, whereupon all sinned." End quote. This is where one of the main places, I guess, where the idea of original sin or original guilt came from. And so he said this is a grave mistranslation, in that idea should not have arisen from there. And the way he talks about it instead, so one thing he says is this it was never as an inherited condition of criminal culpability, but instead he likens it to a disease. So death is the disease, and it's spread by sin. And just as a thought experiment, that was a very helpful way for me to think about it. And especially after COVID, Hart did this translation before COVID, so it's not like he put that in there because we all have disease in our mind or something. But like post-COVID now, we understand this idea of a disease rapidly spreading across the entire world, impacting and infecting all of us or most of us. And so it's kind of fresh on the mind. It just makes sense. I understand that. And it just helped me to think about it, like that there being a disease, and there needs to be a cure for that. And then as is spoken about in Ezekiel that I highlighted in that episode, there's this idea that we need a new heart, like we need a new heart along with the cure. And and then you see that throughout the Bible. You see there's a big part of Hebrews, the letter Hebrews, that talks about this new covenant and the new heart. And so I found that to be very helpful. And as I mentioned before, just Romans 1-8 in general, I was tracking with it this time, tracking with the arguments, and this really helped me to follow it even better. So I've mostly heard my entire life the opposite. I've heard that idea of the original sin, and I've kind of heard this translated and understood in that manner. So this was perhaps a new way of looking at it, and then just that way of thinking about it in terms of disease, sickness being or it being spread by sin. That really helped me to just kind of frame things in my mind. So. Quick recap. With books like the Bible, where maybe you've heard it a lot, you've heard it read, maybe you've read it a lot. Sometimes it's helpful just to have a spark of a fresh translation or a new way of looking at it. Maybe some new words to be thrown at you that just help you to see it in a different light or think about it in a different way. I loved that the introduction and the postscript addressed a number of the questions that I've been having as I've read through the Bible, especially in the areas of the afterlife and time and all that. So if you're kind of in that same boat where you just need a fresh reading of it, I suggest this one. I recommend this one, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now I am moving on to the great books. So March 1st, tomorrow, I will start with my second reading of the Iliad, and I can't wait. I'm going to pair this with a guidebook of the Iliad. So last year I read straight through the Iliad, and really just to get the story down. I was part of a group where we read through the book, but now I'm kind of going to take it slower, read this guidebook. So I'll read the chapter in the guidebook about the chapter, and then I'll read the actual chapter in the Iliad, and I'll go through the whole book that way. Then I'm on to the Greeks. I have a lot of the Greek writings on my list this year. Thank you for listening. I want to highlight quickly my website development company. That's how I fund this reading project, and just for you to keep me in mind if you know of anyone who needs a online presence overhaul or a new website for your company. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you, especially if you've read this translation of the New Testament. Maybe you liked it, maybe you didn't like it, maybe some other things stuck out to you. I would love to hear about those things. I started this reading project as a way to meet other people who are reading the same books that I was. So I really, truly would love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. You can also follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter at Books of Titans. And please go to the website, booksoftitans.com. First off, sign up for the newsletter. I send something out monthly, and more recently, I've been doing it on a weekly basis, just kind of sharing what I'm learning, sharing the books that I'm reading, the podcast episodes that I've done, that sort of thing. I also have a ton of resources on that website to help you find the best books and to create your own reading list. So I will be back in a week or two talking about other books on this year's reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.